Welcome to the EU Energy Projects podcast, a podcast series from Enlit and friends, focusing on the clean energy transition for the European Union and the EU Commission-funded energy projects that will help us achieve it. My name is Areti Ntaradimou. I am the editor of the EU Energy Projects podcast and your host. In this episode of the EU Energy Projects podcast, we're diving into the critical topic of system flexibility, not just as a technical solution, but as a strategic enabler of the energy transition. We'll use the BeFlexible project as a concrete example and go beyond the project itself to look at the policy and regulatory landscape that will determine how far and how fast flexibility can scale. I'm joined by two guests who bring both practical insight and strategic perspective. Anastasia Skapoula, lead of the Dissemination task of the BeFlexible project, and Charles Esser, Secretary General of E.DSO for Smart Grids, the association representing Europe's leading electricity distribution system operators. We'll discuss where innovation is happening, what's still holding it back, and what's needed from policymakers to unlock flexibility as a core asset for a decarbonized Europe. Charles, Anastasia, thank you both very much for being here with me today in this episode. And Charles, my first question is for you. What do you see as the key regulatory or market conditions that currently shape how flexibility is deployed across Europe?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Areti, and thanks very much to Enlit, which we have participated in for many years as E.DSO. So I first wanted to say that. Yes, so I think just to be clear, of course, here we're talking about market flexibility so that producers and customers in coordination adjust their consumption production according to the needs identified, in this case by the DSO. Then we'll talk a little bit about the TSO as well. There could also be a kind of technical flexibility through very kinds of tools to manage and operate the network in a more dynamic way. We'll put that aside for this conversation, I think, today. Flexibility, of course, can be achieved through various things. It can be achieved through demand-side management. It can be achieved through energy storage, adjustments to power generation. When we say demand-side management, that means consumers adjusting what they do, and not just household consumers, but oftentimes industrial consumers. And so I think it's well known that electricity networks need to be kept in constant balance, so between the amount of electricity generated and the amount of consumed. And so flexibility is sort of keeping that balance, but why have it? You want to improve grid stability. You can, if we've seen, of course, if the grid becomes unstable, of course, that was in the transmission network but that was in Spain in April. It can also help us reduce our reliance on fossil fuels because we can have greater integration of renewable resources. Let's say solar and wind have their advantages, but of course they're variable, unlike, let's say, conventional thermal power plant. And so by having flexibility, you can more easily integrate them with the network. You can more efficiently use the network, which in itself has cost savings, and indeed for not only for cost savings for the network itself, but cost savings can be put there for consumers so that they can benefit from their own flexibility. They can benefit from not needing to use their dishwasher at noon rather than at midnight, depending what the situation is. So a lot of regulation has been put in place at European level, and I'll talk mostly at European level today. Of course, there was the electricity regulation, electricity directive from the Clean Energy Package of 2019, and of course these were the regulation focusing more on wholesale markets, the directive focusing a little bit more on retail markets, but both have provisions to enhance the use of flexibility. For example, in the directive, a lot of provisions on enhancing consumer participation in the energy transition, whereas in the regulation, focusing more on wholesale markets. A lot of that is more relevant for the TSO, the transmission system operator, than for us as the DSOs, but still important. And of course, then more recently, from last year, was the sort of electricity market design reform, which amended both the regulation and the directive, incorporated new measures for to increase the share of renewable energy, promote flexibility. Of course, the regulation itself it mandates that member states assess the flexibility needs and potentially set objectives for non-fossil flexibility. It also encourages the use of demand response energy storage. So I think these are some very important things. And of course, which I'll come back to later, particularly when it comes to 2024 legislation, there's implementation issues.
Absolutely, Charles. Seems to me like flexibility is sort of the backbone of the grid, of the energy grid, and it has various ramifications. And we need to compartmentalize in some occasions in order to go deep. Projects, EU-funded projects like BeFlexible, assist in this way. So, Anastasia, I want to come to you now, and I would like to ask you to walk us through the main objectives of the BeFlexible project and how it's designed to advance flexibility at the distribution level.
Thank you, Areti, and I would like to thank you as well from my side for welcoming me to this podcast. It's an honor to be here, representing BeFlexible. So before I start maybe talking about the objectives, just to briefly note that BeFlexible, it's a Horizon Europe project comprising of 21 partners. We have 12 pilots in total in 4 different countries across Europe, in Italy, Spain, France, and Sweden. Which in my view, it's a really strong element of the project, how wide it is, let's say. And in terms of its objectives, I would say the core objective is the fact that it is to find a way to coordinate all together with all relevant actors of the energy system, from household, DSOs, TSOs, aggregators, energy communities, and bring them all together to make sure that they can effectively and actively support the grid in terms of advancing flexibility. Now, to do that, we are doing various things. We are testing new business models and local flexibility platforms. We're looking into new ways of coordinating DSOs and TSOs when they both need flexibility, because they both do and they need to coordinate. For example, in some pilots, specifically in Italy, we're using traffic light schemes to manage local congestion at distribution level without compromising national system stability. And in some others, we're also exploring how EV charging or building thermal loads can respond to price signals or grid constraints, and what kind of services need to be developed to deal with these kinds of constraints. Now, another big part of the work and the objective of BeFlexible is to identify where current regulations and policies are working as hindering factors and as enabling factors accordingly, but also speaking in economic terms. And we do that through real data used in our pilots, extracted from our pilots. And as I mentioned earlier, this happens across different contexts, from urban grids in Spain to rural networks in Sweden. And this helps us ensure that our solutions can be scaled and replicated across Europe. Now, in my view, for DSOs and at distribution level, what is a huge benefit from the project and what they can win from the project is the fact that the project creates, like I said earlier, a collaborative, holistic approach and environment that allows for this coordination that is very much needed in terms of flexibility. We cannot look at flexibility from one side as DSOs, as single entities. Collaboration, in other words, is key. And this is a huge asset of the project, I would say.
Absolutely. Flexibility cannot happen without collaboration, DSOs, TSOs on the first, let's say, level, and then many more other actors to come. Charles, how do initiatives like BeFlexible help translate high-level policy goals into on-the-ground innovation and investment?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a couple of perspectives there that are important to look at. I mean, from one side, of course, we can see what's still lacking, what kind of frameworks are lacking to really actually carry out what we want to do. So I think the project does that, but it also can identify barriers. It is always tricky when you're doing this project simultaneously as implementation is occurring, so that can kind of set, you can sometimes kind of say, well, okay, but if this were implemented, but it isn't yet, but we know it will be, then this would be easier. But I think, one of the BeFlexible project's concrete objectives is to contribute recommendations and solutions from these projects, and these will be brought to the European Commission. And so the European Commission will see directly, okay, this worked and this didn't. And the European Commission, of course, is always thinking about what needs to be done, what needs to be tweaked. They will announce a new legislative package on grids at the end of the year, probably in December. And so these kinds of things can feed into future legislation. But also, I think it's not just about legislation; it's also about projects like BeFlexible really sending a signal to market actors who are outside of the project about what works and what doesn't, what might be a good investment, so that investors are looking at what should we invest in. Or let's say our member DSOs, who, as you mentioned, are amongst Europe's leading DSOs, and in other words, from the largest DSOs in Europe, including all the top 10 largest, are members of E.DSO. So they have considerable resources to invest in. They look at horizon projects and think about what's really worthwhile to invest in, and can help them make the case to the regulator about their investments. Because in the end, as regulated entities, these large capital investments need to be justified and approved. And so having projects like BeFlexible that have EU funds that can do it at lower risk, or allow the regulator to really see what was already done through European funding, can really be a benefit for eventual implementation at larger scale.
Anastasia, do you agree from your more BeFlexible, let's say, point of view, if I may say it like this?
Yes, I completely agree with Charles. And if I am to put it in a more simple way, is how I would say it is that, okay, like high-level policy goals, they tell us, okay, what needs to be done, by when, etc. Projects like BeFlexible show us how to do it and what are the obstacles. They also bring to the surface obstacles and challenges that the regulator or the policymaker, once proposing something, unless they have their eyes on the ground on what is actually happening, maybe they cannot foresee certain challenges. And also, especially since we're talking in the context of Europe, in many different contexts of Europe, so it's impossible to foresee, let's say, and to be prepared for all the different challenges that may come up. And that's what we do. For example, in Rome and in Bilbao, we are testing, in Benidorm, actually, we're testing what kind of consumer incentives could work in a tourist city. So what the high-level policy goals will say that, okay, yeah, we should incentivize consumers. And BeFlexible will tell you how you should do it, and whether this specific approach that we're taking works or not. And in terms of investment, like Charles also said, of course, when relevant companies see that new business models that are being tested in projects like BeFlexible are working, for example, aggregating EV charging or heat pumps, it gives them confidence to boost investment commercially. It's like policy learning by doing, I would say.
So I really like what you said, going and doing in the same, let's say, frame. However, some things have a strategic, let's say, option in them, and we can't just see and go as it goes. So I would like to ask you, Charles, how well do current regulatory frameworks support the type of innovation needed to scale flexibility solutions?
I think, and I mentioned this already in a little bit, the word implementation, but I'll get into it a bit more. I think part of it is that a lot of frameworks are there that are not being used yet simply because legislation isn't implemented yet. Maybe that's fair enough when it comes to directive from last year, but when it comes to clean energy package, I mean, this is something that probably is let's say, less justified, and so we still need a kind of a complete, let's say, implementation to really understand how well current regulatory frameworks are doing this, let's say at a European level. I would say at a member state level, what we hear from our members, and it's something we're looking at in terms of particularly in the revenue regulation kind of side, is that some member state regulators, let's say, are more forward thinking than others. I'm not here to name names, But definitely, we get the feedback that we get from our members is that there's a real heterogeneity amongst member state regulators in terms of how much their frameworks are really supporting the kind of innovation that's needed. There are definitely some best practices out there, and that's something that we, outside of the project and more on the side of the association, let's say, are working on to really understand what are those best practices. I would also point out too that there's ongoing additional frameworks. There's a network code on demand response that's being worked out, and that's still in process. Though the European Commission has emphasized, for example, at the Florence Forum in the last couple of years when I've been there, they've said don't wait for the network code on demand response. There's a lot you can do without the network code. And so while the network code is good or we wouldn't be doing it, there is a lot that we can do. And so some of the implementation is out there. But given a lot of untapped potential for flexibility, probably the frameworks can still be better. But I think there's also, it's not just about frameworks, it's also about making those investments, taking the time for those investments to bear fruit. Regulators having sandboxes as well. It's not just horizon projects, as important as they are, but also allowing for regulatory sandboxes to occur on some of these things. Again, some regulators better than others on that, or just maybe better is not the right word, but just have done more. So I would say probably overall a kind of a mixed picture, but it's not necessarily, it's complicated why it's a mixed picture. It's not simply because someone wrote something that's halfway good. It's more complicated. It's much more complicated than that.
You're absolutely right, but I do like the way that you, in a way, wed the do things as we go and learn from our experience and a strategic vision, because both aspects I think are needed when it comes to regulation, not only for flexibility but for other things like AI, etc. Anastasia, I was wondering, because you're the one mentioning the go as learn as we go. Do you agree with what Charles mentioned, the way he created a wedding between strategy and experience?
Yes, definitely. I totally agree. And from what we can say from BeFlexible point of view in terms of the challenges that we see, because in terms of regulatory framework support for flexibility, we see, and we can certainly say that we've come a long way, and we need to recognize that there is effort being made, and that flexibility is recognized as a valuable aspect, let's say, of the energy system. And we've opened the door to new actors like energy communities and aggregators. But when we look closer to specific contexts and how these regulations, for example, or all sorts of regulations related to flexibility are applied on the ground, we still see several challenges. And that's where BeFlexible, like mentioned earlier, being on the ground, sees these challenges. And one of the core challenges that I would here highlight is the fragmentation. And Charles also mentioned that flexibility in theory might be supported, but the mechanisms behind it, for example, the tariffs, the local markets, the connection agreements and whatnot, are designed separately, and they don't always work well together. But this is why we are here to kind of find ways of standardizing the processes. But I can talk more about this later.
Absolutely. But you gave me a really nice assist to ask a question to Charles about the barriers. Now, I would like to use your vast experience, Charles, and ask you to be critical and tell us what are some of the key regulatory or structural barriers that limit DSOs from investing in innovative solutions.
One of the things may be simply a focus on short-term cost control. And I know this is also a topic that you wanted to get into, and maybe I can kind of combine it here a bit. Sometimes when you have very sort of strict short-term cost control, it can lead to not being able to make those kinds of long-term investments that are needed, or trading off cost control now versus long-term solutions. Ultimately, and coming back to what I was saying about flexibility unlocking variable renewables into the grid, I mean, of course, variable renewables have close to zero marginal cost. And so unlocking that, getting to a point where we have, where at least not on many days, gas is not, the marginal cost is not being set by gas-fired plants, we're going to really need to unlock a lot more variable renewable energy, and as such, that kind of lower cost in the long term is really where it kind of could be a barrier if we don't have a regulatory framework that's really going to allow for those investments. That understand, of course, that consumers are concerned about their short-term costs now, and telling them that they'll have cheaper electricity 10 years from now and more secure electricity is kind of nice, but they may say, yes, but I have to pay my bills today. And so this is why, as E.DSO, we've invested in projects, and our members want to. It's not just E.DSO that's in projects; it's our members who are in these projects as well, looking for innovations, but also at the same time, it's necessary. And if we look at the proposal on the multi-annual financial framework from the Commission, that we may need some kinds of let's say, bridge subsidies or bridge loans to help us get through this period to really unlock those kinds of investments. So I would say there's that. Regulatory barriers. Yeah, it's of course in some places maybe getting a sandbox is more difficult than others to try out new things. That could be a barrier. I would say, though, happily, Esser and SEER just last week published a guidance on distribution network development plans. And one of the things that we as E.DSO really liked was that they said that the DSO should be looking at the national energy and climate plans of the member state when drawing up their distribution network development plans. And that means taking a long-term perspective. And that means that they themselves being the sort of ACE, of course, is the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, and SEER being their own association. That's at least a push from the top that we really like. And so we want regulatory stability. I think that's a possible another barrier when you have instability. That probably is our largest one. There are a number of other things that could be identified, and we identified some of them in the response to the European Commission's consultation. But overall, I would say these are the things that I would identify first of all.
Makes total sense, Charles. Thank you very much for this comprehensive and to the point. Anastasia, I don't know if you would like to add something?
I think Charles pretty much covered it. I would only reiterate, let's say, maybe two key points that I can bring into this discussion, again, from the perspective of BeFlexible, is that in order for this balance to be found between short-term cost and long-term system value, we first need to see truly neutral incentives so that grid operators are not pushed towards building new infrastructure just because it's rewarded, but they can choose flexibility solutions instead, because it can be, and it is in most cases in the long run, the most efficient option for the whole system. And secondly, planning in a longer horizon instead of a short-term horizon, which means that, building flexibility scenarios directly into network development plans and updating them as technologies scale up as well.
It's not so much energy regulators, but it is a regulatory issue, and so I should bring it up, of course, is the well-known issue of lengthy permitting time as well, which can also sometimes, depending what it is, sometimes flexibility is not so affected by that, but it could be, for example, the new energy storage project or something like that.
Absolutely. And this is where I would like to evaluate or see a little bit the role of E.DSO for smart grids in this context. And I would like to ask you, Charles, how does E.DSO for smart grids envision the evolving role of DSOs in coordinating flexibility resources, especially in the context of increasing electrification and decentralization?
Yes, that's a very comprehensive question, I must say. And I think that we ourselves see an ever greater role, right? I mean, if you think about the DSO some years ago, it was a one-way, just taking what the TSO sent us and taking down the voltage and putting it on, and that was a relatively, let's say, simple task. And now, of course, it's not a simple task at all, with so much distributed generation, with demand response, with people having let's say, batteries at home with vehicle to grid or with heat pumps and so forth. It can also be a kind of storage. So it's a much more complicated job now for the DSO. And so at the same time, increasing electrification will mean that the grids have even more power on them, or that we need to expand the grids. And I think it's a combination of, and I should say this, it's not just about flexibility, but it's also increased investment. We do need to build out. It's not an either or, it's a both from the perspective of E.DSO. And so I think you're going to have a shift away from the energy cost and into the, let's say, grid planning cost to a certain extent. And that's as long as the overall cost for the consumer, when you think about the cost of not paying for petrol anymore, not having to import fossil fuels, which can be high cost or have spikes due to international politics and things like that. The overall cost for the consumer, we think, will be beneficial to have increased electrification. We think increased electrification will actually make possible these kinds of investments that we need. And so DSOs will play an ever greater role, but we'll also need the companies like the battery storage operators, which of course DSOs are prohibited from owning, or charge point operators, or heat pump companies that design their heat pumps in a way that's, let's say, grid friendly. All this kind of grid friendly investment is something that we need. And I think this is really the key thing, is that we can, when we think about the investments that are needed, and of course there's your Electric famous Grids for Speed report from last year that outlined some of the costs, but certainly those costs can also be taken down when we make the kinds of investments that are grid friendly. And so what we look for as DSOs is regulatory and political support to make the investments in a grid friendly way. And this can also mean, now when we look at issues like going away from first come first served and connections, and looking at who gets the connection first. And of course, there are social issues, undoubtedly, and just make the analogy that the hospital gets connected before the casino. But likewise, it may be that the grid-friendly data center gets connected before the grid-unfriendly data center, all else equal. And so I think that's that kind of cooperation and thinking about things and having things being taken into account in a much more complex way. Going away from first come, first serve is just one example of that, is where we're going with that.
Another example is also the various nationalities, the various countries within the European Union, because we are a multinational entity in the European Union, that can also perplex things a little bit more, because not all countries within the Union are on the same level of absorbing or researching or innovating when it comes to flexibility. So, Anastasia, I would like to ask you at this point, on behalf of BeFlexible, which has pilots in 4 different European countries, as you said, how important is EU-level alignment in regulation to ensure that flexibility is scalable across different national systems?
Really nice question. So, surprise, EU alignment is very, very important. It's absolutely key for a lot of things, flexibility, of course, as well. And like you said, okay, we have an EU-wide approach, but in the end of the day, when we reach the national level, we end up with a patchwork of different realities. And what we see in BeFlexible is that this diversity creates a learning opportunity, because what we can do is look for the lowest common denominators, let's say, and we need to look for the ways that we can collaborate in order to agree upon certain common principles that we can, because what we see is that, okay, one flexibility model or approach or technology that might work in one pilot, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will work in another, or it might. So we need to identify these challenges or these opportunities. When setting up these common principles, we should consider, okay, maybe we can find some common ground in terms of how we share our data, what are the roles? Because like I said earlier, the energy system and achieving flexibility requires the contribution of many different actors in the energy system. So what are the roles that each actor should have? How should we conduct cost-benefit assessments? So answering these questions and finding those common principles will make it much easier to replicate successful solutions and create a truly Europe-wide flexibility market rather than isolated national experiments. So we do expect that projects like BeFlexible set the ground for a more EU-wide solution.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of the roles that you mentioned, of the various actors, I would like to discuss a little bit the roles and the collaboration between DSOs and TSOs. My question is to you, Charles. What kinds of collaboration between DSOs and TSOs and third parties, perhaps solution providers, etc., do you believe are essential for the future of smart grids? But not everything, like the essential ones, if you had to choose two or three, let's say.
Well, I was thinking about this a little bit, and I really thought of the GoPax example in the Netherlands, which GoPax is the grid operators platform for ancillary services, but it's really a tool used by DSOs and TSOs and others participating to handle congestion, that is, reduce capacity shortages on the grid. And so the Dutch DSOs and the TSO are involved in this, and it allows them to sort of, in this platform, along with the congestion service providers, to really manage congestion and increase flexibility at all sort of voltage levels, and really thinking about whether you do that with via Tenet, the TSO, or you do that for one of our Dutch members, really to actually be able to handle that all at once with a complicated and integrated platform that's obviously has its algorithms that are more complicated than I can explain myself. But I think that's kind of the example of a cooperation that would be needed for that. And so you really want to maximize the interchange by having a kind of integrated platform. Of course, DSOs and the TSO in each member state, or in a member state that has more than one TSO, such as Germany. Of course, various TSOs talk to DSOs in their area, and our members are always talking to the TSO and have dedicated staff for that. At European level, of course, it's also that in some of the projects, we actually work with TSOs on these projects. And so I'm not remembering now, Anastasia, whether there's the TSO particularly in BeFlexible, but certainly in other projects like Twin EU, which is a project to create a kind of a virtual twin of the entire electricity system in the EU, that has the participation of lots of DSOs and TSOs, and of course E.DSO and ENSOE. And so I think these kinds of projects, whether it's a Horizon project or it's an actual platform such as GoPax, or it's a kind of daily dialogue between the DSO and the TSO, or work at European level with ENSOE, and including the E.DSO entity as well does work with ENSOE. I think all those kinds of levels of cooperation are important to take us to where we need to go with the TSOs. And certainly in the future, we're looking at New Horizon projects calls and looking to work with TSOs on those project calls. And we're encouraged that the European Commission does put out Horizon projects that involve TSOs and DSOs to work more closely on issues like flexibility. There's a particular project call that's out now and that on this, and I can come back to that in a bit if you want. But I think this is really the way to go, and pleased that the European Commission sees the importance of us working together, whether it's a Horizon project or beyond.
Yeah, I think the European Commission is quite adamant in the collaboration between DSOs and TSOs. And yes, there are plenty of programs. It's not only Horizon. There are other programs also like LIFE, etc., that, let's say, instigate and support the collaboration, which is indeed very needed and top. Anastasia, what policy shift or support mechanism would have the biggest positive impact on accelerating flexibility adoption right now from the point of view of a project, and specifically BeFlexible?
Yeah, I would say this is quite a difficult question. I don't think it's really possible to separate and highlight one specific policy shift. I would I would, let's say, extract an approach on the basis of the challenges that we addressed earlier that have to do with the fragmentation and the incentives that are at times biased, let's say, and not neutral. But in terms of BeFlexible, I would once again highlight the importance of finding ways to create collaboration in such a fragmented context. And projects like BeFlexible, like I mentioned earlier, they find and as a final result, they also have some common principles that can be scaled. And one thing that we could focus on or could be focused on is to really making the most out of these common principles, to taking from BeFlexible and other equivalent projects, allowing them to collaborate to find these common principles and really basing any policy shift on the basis of these principles. That's what I would have to add.
Thank you, Anastasia. Charles, what is your opinion? Also take into consideration that you have the experience of Twin EU that you mentioned, a very big and very important, if I may say so, project for the European grid.
Well, I would echo what Anastasia said, and I mean, I think that that kind of support at the European level is really essential, and we see it going forward, and we think that there are still yet things to discover. I was just thinking about, for example, the Horizon call on control and operation tools for REST-based energy system that also has potential to help with flexibility. And so I think these kinds of efforts, as they go on, will develop a more the kind of cooperation and system that we need. And it's important because, of course, as well, we would need to take into account that technology is always changing. I would note that for us as E.DSO, one of the things we've tried to do is we've developed something called a technology radar to look ahead at things that can come in the future, and some of those deal with flexibility. I'd also say that in certain cases, we've developed something called success cases, where some of our members have taken things in various areas, from human resources to developing a new technology, or using a new technology. But some of them, these success cases, and they're on our website, are cases where a particular member has been able to go further with flexibility than perhaps some others by taking an innovative approach. And so part of why E.DSO exists is to share those innovative approaches. Fortunately, as DSOs, we're not a competitive industry in the sense that our members are not directly competing with each other. They may be benchmarked against each other in some member states, but nevertheless, there's really an incentive to rather share best practices. That's kind of one of the main reasons why an association like E.DSO exists.
Yeah, that's actually quite good cooperation. Is like the mother of all things, not war, as Heraclitus said. Maybe, I don't know. But as we're approaching the end of our conversation, unfortunately, because I would love to pick your brains for a lot more time than I already have, I would like us to leave this conversation with a message towards the Commission. So I would like to ask you both, what one message would you like to leave policymakers with regarding flexibility and the role of innovation in Europe's energy transition? Anastasia, ladies first. So please let us know.
Thank you, Areti. I will kind of maybe take a similar approach to my answer in the previous question. I will just say that, okay, as projects, we do our share. We have our exploitation strategies. We come up with our results and whatnot that businesses will exploit and make use of in the future. But I feel like at policy level, pay attention to what projects like BeFlexible work on and what their outcomes are, and really integrate these tangible results into any policy developments that we expect ahead.
Well said. I totally agree with you, Charles.
Thank you. I certainly agree with Anastasia, and sort of so taking that as a given. I'll just add one more thing, thinking about policymakers and considering, that we've been talking about the cooperation between TSOs and DSOs or with industry. I think policymakers, they'll have a role maybe and we do talk to them, but I think in terms of the general consumer, I mean, there's the demand side of all of this. And that means, human behavior. And, policymakers really trying to lead on that and understanding that there's a better electricity system to be had in the future with consumer participation. Granted, that consumer participation should be easy. It shouldn't be a new job for everyone on top of their current work life, but it really has a real benefit that can be played. And so with, let's say, a minimal effort, that we can really have a much better system, can really have a system where your appliances are smart, where you're and really responding to the DSO, and you can benefit from that. And so I think that's I think if I were to have a message for policymakers who talk to them, maybe let's say here, have facing the general public, I would add that.
Excellent. And I'm sure your messages will reach the policymakers via this podcast, this humble podcast, but also via Enlit Europe in Bilbao, 18-20 of November, where both of you will be there representing BeFlexible and E.DSO for smart grids. Thank you so much, both of you, for this really interesting conversation.
Thank you, Areti.
Thank you, Areti.
You've been listening to the EU Energy Projects podcast, a podcast brought to you by Enlit and Friends. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, and the Enlit World website. Just hit subscribe, and you can access our other episodes too. I'm Areti Ntaradimou. Thank you for joining us.